and 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you in part by Mantis. The Mantis is a small device that attaches to your firearm and gives you shot-by-shot analysis on your performance. And the best part is it works in dry fire, which we think is a critical component to improving your shooting skills. Jim and I have a couple new products for Mantis on their way for us to test, so be sure to subscribe and follow us for updates on that. Make every shot count. Check out the Mantis at mantisx.com for data-driven performance. My guest today is Brian Willis. Brian worked for the Calgary Police Service for over 25 years and was a police trainer and supervisor, among other things. He currently serves as the Deputy Executive Director for the International Law Enforcement Educator and Trainers Association, or ILETA, where he develops instructors from all over the world. And he is also the founder and CEO of Winning Mind Training, which is a company that focuses on leadership and instructor development training for law enforcement. One of his goals, if I understand it correctly, just kind of pulling off his website here, is to challenge police officers to achieve excellence in their careers and in their training and never settle for mediocrity, which is a goal that very much is in line with our purpose in creating this podcast. And I think that purpose would well serve not only those in law enforcement, but anyone working in public safety or the military, or even who just takes training for survival and personal defense seriously. Before I ever met Brian, I saw a TED Talk that he did called The Most Dangerous Weapon in Law Enforcement. And Brian's talk articulated several challenges that police officers face, and he did it in a powerful way. And I won't spoil any surprises for you, but I will put a link in the show notes of his talk, and I hope you'll go watch it. Brian's talk was an inspiration for Jim and I from the very beginning. In fact, I remember thinking to myself that I wanted the episodes that we did to have the impact and the clarity that Brian delivered in his talk, and it's served as a model and a goal for us to work towards ever since. Brian, thanks for joining us.
It's certainly my pleasure, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So there's so many things that I want to ask you about, and it's always hard to kick this off in a good way that is also respectful of the time that we have and obviously the time of our listeners. But I think a good basis for all of this is going to be around training and instructor development. And so since I brought up the TED Talk, I thought course design might be a good place to start. I've seen several TED Talks. They are almost always very good, even the stuff that is, topics that I wouldn't otherwise be interested in. And one thing I've noticed is that most of them have in common is the slides or the images that presenters are using are very thoughtfully done. There's not a lot of words on the screen, and the focus stays on the presenter. And I've also been a teacher of some form for years now, and I've put together several presentations in my day, and I've learned that many of us struggle, and I often still struggle, to stay on task and keep a clear path without writing every word out of our lesson plan onto the PowerPoint slides. Can you offer us any insights related to lesson plan design and rehearsing your course and balancing your presentation with visual aids?
Absolutely. So if we start with the visual aids, and it's not that that's where we'd start in creating the course, but you kind of led off with that. I think one of the things that was most impactful for me is a number of years ago, I had heard some presentations by a gentleman by the name of Gar Reynolds. He currently lives over in Japan. He's an American, but he lives over in Japan, teaches at a Japanese university, teaches design, worked for, I believe, Google before he went there. But I read a book that he wrote a number of years ago called Presentation Zen. And one of the things that he says that really struck me is that we as trainers tend to use PowerPoint as a teleprompter. So we put all of the stuff that we want to say on our slides. And his philosophy, and it's supported by Nancy Duarte in her book Slideology and Resonate and others, is that we should have minimal words on the slide. We should have high quality pictures that relate to something that we're talking about on the slide. And that what that does is it's more engaging for the audience. But what it does from a trainer's perspective is it forces us to know the material at a deeper level. If you poll people around North America about their biggest complaints with PowerPoint, it's things like too much data on the slide, font is too small, they can't read it. Color combinations are horrible. They can't read what's on the slide. The instructor turns their back to the audience and reads word for word from the slide. There are other complaints are too much stuff flying in, flying out, and all these sound effects. And all those things are distracting. And so I think one of the things that we need to remember with things like PowerPoint is that, and it's not the tool. I don't care whether you use in Prezi or PowerPoint or Keynote, it's how you use it. And one of the things that I think we've got sucked into by the way that classrooms are designed, and they're designed generally by people that don't teach, is the screen is right in the middle of the classroom. The lectern with all of your connections for your laptop or the computer are off in the corner, and they want you to stand behind the lectern, make the screen and your PowerPoint presentation the focal point. And those are visual aids. They should be aids to a presentation. You should be ideally the focal point of the presentation, and then there should be a lot of engagement between you and the audience. So for trainers, I would strongly recommend you read Presentation Zen, look at modifying your presentation. If the screen is movable, move it over to what would be the front right corner of the room if you're sitting in an audience seat. So that, because people tend to read left to right. So they will focus on you at the center of the room, then over to the screen, and then back to you. So I think when we're designing training, what we need to start asking ourselves now is, how can we best engage the audience to ensure that they learn and retain the information? And this, I think, is critical. And this is where I think public safety is different from any other educational institution. If you go to a class in high school, college, university, fundamentally the goal of the teacher in most cases is to have you be able to pass the test so that you can graduate their course. If they can get you to pass the test with a high enough mark, then it makes them look like a really good instructor. They really don't care if you have the ability to retain the information a week or 2 weeks after the test or after the class is over. But in public safety, the test is ongoing for the next 20 or 25 years of your career, and it's in real-world environments. So I think what we need to do from an instructional design perspective is look at the research. I'd recommend people read the book Make It Stick. Peter Brown is the lead author. Rudiger and McDaniels are the co-authors. They're some of the leading experts in the world on human memory. And then figure out, how do we take the research and the science on how people learn and apply it to our training? Because our goal should be not only can they pass the test, but can they actually learn it? Can they retain it? Can they apply it down the road? And so it requires us to take a step back and think differently about all of the training that we're doing. And are we actually striving for that goal, or are we trying to just get them to pass the immediate test?
Yeah, there's a lot of good points in there. And now I'm going to have to go back to my audiobook file and add a bunch of books to it. So I'm going to stay busy with that. So I have kind of related to this, I have a short story to share about Brian that helps illustrate the kind of guy he is in terms of, really investing in people and developing instructors. I went to the ILETA conference back in March, which is where police trainers from all over get together and kind of share notes, and we offer classes to each other. And I did a presentation there that Brian came and watched, and I asked him for some critiques and ideas for improvement. And one of the things we talked a lot about was engagement. And instructors, I see, and this is important, I think, related to what you were saying, Brian, about getting people to actually retain it, is you want that higher level learning, not just that they can recite it or remember it, but that actually, like you said, that they can apply it and they can use it in their day-to-day tasks, which, as you mentioned, especially important in a public safety type of job. Instructors often want to generate thoughtful discussion. And that was one area that you and I talked at length about, and you gave me a lot of great advice. I went to an instructor development course recently, and they taught us that the student should always be working harder than the teacher. And I thought that was a good way of thinking about it in terms of actually getting people to switch on and be engaged and be thoughtful and try to make it stick. Not to steal the book title that you mentioned, but to actually get people to internalize this stuff. And instructors always want that, but sometimes it's difficult to achieve. And there's ways to do it through group activities and brainstorming sessions. And when I went to your class that you taught at ILETA, that seemed to fit in. That mentality that the students should be working harder than the teacher seemed to kind of fit. Do you agree with that? It's a two-part question, I guess, is do you agree with that statement or that philosophy? And two, can you give us some ideas on ways to stimulate dialogue and get people to participate?
Well, absolutely, that the students absolutely need to be working throughout this and working to understand and figure out how to apply it. And I think it's a team effort that even if we're facilitating and doing less formal instruction, it's a tremendous amount of work to connect the dots for people to pull that information out, to work at all of the cues so that people actually are learning and retaining. So the question always comes up, as you said, is how do we engage people? The challenge that a lot of us have is we grew up in an environment where it was instructor-centered instruction. The instructor stood up at the front and they talked for the whole time, and the students sat there and listened, and we assumed that learning was taking place. And the research would suggest that that's probably not the case. So every instructor has been told that you need to get people involved, engaged, but they've all had that experience where you throw a question out to the class and there's absolute silence in the class, and nobody's going to engage with that. So there's a couple things. Number one is embrace the silence and be patient. The research would suggest probably 8 to 10 seconds of silence, and people in the room are going to get so uncomfortable that somebody will then volunteer an answer or somehow get engaged, and then we can feed off of that once one person does it. That 10 seconds when you're standing up at the front of the room feels like forever, however. So some other ways that we can do it is we can put a concept or a principle or a quote or something either up on the board or get people to read it. And then you can get people to think about it. So there's two elements here. Is that number one was we talk a lot about brainstorming. The challenge historically with brainstorming is that when you put people in a group and you say, hey, brainstorm this topic, those conversations are dominated by extroverts. That's not a knock on extroverts. It just they're more comfortable talking. The introverts will sit there quietly and very often contribute very little. So if you can give people something to work on, so something that they might read a short paragraph, or there's a quote up on the screen, or you give them a question or a philosophy, and then you have them take and highlight or underline something in that handout, or write down the key takeaways from that principle or that concept or that quote. And then you can put them in small groups and say, okay, now get into groups of 2 or 3 and have a discussion, and each person share what your highlights or your takeaways were and have a discussion around that. And then you can go around and call on groups. Now, you don't have to call on every group every time. I might call on a third of the groups this time, and then the next exercise I might call on different groups. Every time you do it, you can leave the groups the same, or you can mix them up. You can get people up and say you have to go partner up with somebody that is not seated beside you, in front of you, or behind you, because they're going to want to just work with the people that are seated physically close to them. And it does a few things. It gets people up moving around. It gets people talking and engaging. And now you can start to pull stuff out of everybody in the class and get people more engaged, involved. The bigger the audience, the harder it is to do, but you can still do some of that. So I've done some of that with groups as large as 500 or 600. Now, it's very challenging, and depending on the layout of the room, it can be tough to go and call on those groups. You can still have them do the work, have them write it out, have them have that discussions, and then in some cases, like a week ago where there was a group of about 300, I was able to walk around the room and call on different groups throughout the day. what that does is it gets people moving, it gets them thinking, it gets them talking, and they start to realize that there's no right answer, that they have the ability to come up with their own concepts, their own ideas, and they start to make some of those connections. And then they start to hear from other people in the room what they got out of it, their connections that they made. And that's one way that we can get people engaged in some of this content and actually enhance some of the learning. So it's just one strategy. There are certainly others that you could utilize.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things in there that I want to highlight. There was another quote in that same class where I heard the students working harder than the teacher thing. He also mentioned something along the lines of talking is not teaching, listening is not learning. And I think you hit on that in there. And I know, in terms of the student working harder than the teacher, maybe there's some room for refinement in what we mean by that, because absolutely, as you alluded to, you have to be in touch as the teacher, in touch with your audience and finding ways to pull stuff out. And that takes engagement on your end as well. But the idea is that the engagement is where you really start to find that. And there's another concept that I think is important for people to understand, and that is just the nature of having a defense mechanism, a barrier up when people first come into a room, and it's just a group dynamics thing. You get a group together, and everyone's got to feel each other out. Who are the smart ones? Who are the loud ones? Who are the quiet ones? Who are the funny ones? Once you can get through that barrier a little bit, I've noticed that people tend to do a lot better. And I think, the tips that you offered me at ILETA and obviously just now in talking about it are good ways to break that barrier down. But I think it helps if people think about getting through that defense mechanism. That's really what it is, right?
Absolutely. And, the challenge as trainers is you deal with training scars that have been created by other trainers. So if you've been embarrassed or belittled or demeaned before in a training class, not by me, but by somebody else, well, you're going to show up and that defense mechanism is up in a big way. And you're showing up with a chip on your shoulder. Now, if I show up with a chip on my shoulder as well, then that's not going to go well. So we need to understand, and we get hung up about people sitting at the back of the room. But you know what? You go to a class where it's all trainers, and they generally will fill from the back of the room to the front of the room. So part of that is about how do you make it safe for people? So, because that's the key. So that's why when you start some of the small group work, you can let them work with the person beside them, because a lot of times they're sitting beside their friends anyways. Or even if they sat beside somebody they don't know, they probably introduced themselves. So you can start by that, working with somebody seated close to you. And then as you go on throughout the day, then you can have them get up and move around. And again, it's how you address those comments that they make or the feedback that they give you, if you're open to that, and if you help them to perhaps reframe some of it or think about it in different ways. Even just having people pausing. So what I'll do in a full day workshop is I'll pause about halfway through and say, okay, I want you to reflect on what we have covered so far today, and I want you to write down your 2 greatest takeaways from what we've covered in the first half of the day. And I'll let everybody do that. And then I'll say, okay, now write down an action step for each of those 2 items. So they'll do that. And then I'll get them to stand up and partner up with somebody in the room that's not seated close to them and just exchange that information. So now they might talk to somebody. You and I can sit through the same 8-hour class, but we're going to get different things, different takeaways, because we're looking for different takeaways from that. We're looking for different information, different things are going to stick with us. And now they get some different ideas. You and I might have the same takeaways, but we got very different action items. Then we can spend, what I'll do at the end of a class is, if it's a one-day program, is I'll have people spend a few minutes at the end. I'll just say, turn to a blank piece of paper without looking back at your notes and just write out what you learned today. And just keep writing until I tell you what to do next. And after they do that for a number of minutes, then I'll have them write down action items for how they can apply what they've learned, and then name them of an accountability partner, somebody that they're going to reach out to and say, this is the action steps I committed to throughout the whole day. Here's the time frame I want you to hold me accountable. So those are just different ways that we can take some of the research that talks about the need for reflection and active or effortful retrieval of information that's going to help make it stickier. By me explaining a principle or concept or something I took away to you, it helps to make it stickier for me. You might hear it in a different way that now that makes more sense than the way the instructor said it. So all of these things are designed to engage people and enhance the actual learning that takes place during a class.
There's a couple times you've mentioned, classes that might be something you do throughout the day and some techniques. What about time management when it comes to, you've got a 1 hour or a 2 hour class? Because sometimes, you want to get people doing this discussion stuff, and maybe you have a group activity or small groups, 2s or 3s, like you suggest, and you're trying to lead them to a certain point. And maybe this is part of the issue is in terms of course design, being dynamic enough to take what you get, as opposed to, if you're trying to draw a specific conclusion out of your audience or make a specific point, and you've got a 1 or 2 hour window to accomplish that. What are your thoughts on designing your course or your group activities in a way that you can still manage what probably feels like a time crunch for a lot of instructors?
And it's a great question, and we've all been there. And one of the mistakes that we often make when we're designing that is that we take a longer class. So we take a 4 or an 8 hour class, we have a 2 hour time block or a 1 hour time block, and we try and stuff all of that information from 4 or 8 hours into that 2 hour block. And it's not going to work very well. There's way too much information. So what you need to do is be ruthless about cutting information out. Decide in this time frame that I have, what are the key takeaways that these people need to have within this time frame? And then how can I engage them in that? Now, what's helpful is if you have some information perhaps or in your presentation that might be nice to know, but it's not need to know. Because some groups are going to be very talkative. They're going to ask a ton of questions. You're going to have some great discussions, and you're not going to be able to get to all the stuff in your presentation. So what I would suggest is that once you work through and design and come up with the key learning points and make sure that there is an appropriate number of learning points for the time that you have allotted, then design the learning activities. You can estimate how much time you're going to need for those. And then when you build, if you're using, and you don't always have to use PowerPoint or Keynote, but if you're using that, then build in some flexibility so that there's some information in there that is nice to know. So if it's one of those super quiet groups and the conversations are short, there's not a lot of questions in the class, then you can cover that information. Now, what's offensive to an audience is when you start blasting through the slides and saying, well, you know what, we don't have time for this, we don't have time for this, well, this is a really great video, but we don't have time to show it, we're running out of time. And that's offensive to the audience. So what I would suggest people do is once you design that, and if you're using Keynote or PowerPoint, and you don't have to, but if you are, say you're using PowerPoint, then print off the handouts that have the 9 slides per page. Not that I don't give those handouts to the audience. Print them out for yourself. Number every one of those slides. Know which material is need to cover, need to have, and which is nice to cover. And then keep that up front for you. So let's say I have 60 slides in a presentation, and I'm on slide 30, and we've had some great conversations, but I need to jump to slide 45. It's offensive if I blast through 15 slides. But if I simply on the keyboard on my laptop type in 4-5 enter, it'll jump straight to slide 45. And nobody knows that I've jumped over 15 slides. And then we just keep going from there. And if I need to jump around, I can. Yeah, in Keynote and in the newer versions of PowerPoint, there's presenter's view, and there's usually a scroll bar or something where you can have a look at what slides are coming up. While they're engaged in conversations, you can kind of scroll ahead, and then you can just use that to jump ahead. But that's a way that you can manage that material and manage those conversations. Now, again, if you give people, say, okay, you're going to each person's going to take 2 minutes and explain this concept to the other person, and you kind of control that, then you can control the times. But that's a way to get people engaged and have the flexibility, so when you have conversations that are going deeper, you're not having to say, well, look, we've got to cut this off, or you're not blasting through slides and offending the audience.
There's several key takeaways in there, and I've been guilty of probably all of them. At the ILETA conference, that's one good place to start. The class that I was teaching, I had so much stuff that I was trying to get through, and it was a new class, and I was trying to fit as much as I could, but it was probably a little ambitious, and I've certainly been guilty of that. And of course, skipping through slides, I think that tip of being able to jump to slides, I mean, that's just a software thing that I didn't even know about, so that's a good call. I think there's a lot of things that you can pull from this, and it's important that, like you said, Brian, you find the one thing or the 2 or 3 things or whatever, the key points that you want them to leave with, and that you really focus on that and build it from the ground up. And this podcast is Tactical Tangents. Haha. I tend to go off on a lot of those, and I do it when I design courses. And that's the next thing that you mentioned in there that I think is important for instructors to remember, is that you don't have to use PowerPoint. And we tend to get locked into this. Well, are we going out to the range, or are we going to the mat room, or are we going out to the driving track, or are we going into the classroom? And if we're going to the classroom, then this is what we're expecting to see. And we've got to get out of that and challenge that assumption. Did I get those takeaways right? Is that a good summation of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And like you say, just build the course first, build the AV to augment it afterwards, but just understand that PowerPoint is something that we are used to using, but it's not necessary. There's some people that do great presentations, very long presentations, never use a single PowerPoint slide at all, or use a total of 5. There's other people like Seth Godin, the marketing guy, who will use a massive amount of slides in his presentation, in a short presentation, but it's just a really good flow for it. So you just got to find what works for you, and it's just experimentation.
Absolutely. And your presentation, your slides, is not your lesson plan. And I know that, at least in the law enforcement training world, everyone fundamentally knows that, because they've seen the lesson plan separate from the PowerPoint, but they don't ever look back at the lesson plan. They look at the PowerPoint, and they use that as their guide, and that is probably the root of the problem, is they're looking at the slides like a lesson plan. And kind of like you said earlier, it's almost like a teleprompter, and that is a misuse of the tool. That's not what it's there for.
Absolutely.
So your company, Winning Mind Training, has a course called Excellence in Training. And from what I've learned from you and the conversations that we've had, you work to challenge the status quo and hopefully push us to grow and to get better, which is something that I mentioned this earlier, but aligns closely with certainly my personal philosophy and training. But a lot of times in law enforcement, and you see this other places, the military, public safety, all over, we hear that we're teaching to the lowest common denominator. We have to dumb things down for the lowest common denominator. What are your thoughts on that attitude?
It frustrates me to no end. So it's to me, it's insulting to the audience, because we're making this assumption about who or what the lowest common denominator is. It's the same as the philosophy of people don't rise to the level of the occasion or the challenge. They will sink to the level of their training. And to me, that's an insult to all trainers, because it says that our training has not prepared people to rise to the occasion. So if we step back from that mentality of teach the lowest common denominator, and we hear that, you got to teach to the twos. And you hear that a lot with in-service training. Well, we got to start from square one because these people all forget. No, you don't. When people come in for in-service training, they are frustrated by the fact that in some in-service training, they could tell you before you ever start the class, okay, here's what we're going to do first, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to see this slide, then we're going to hear this joke, and then we're going to do this exercise, then we're going to do this, and because it's the same every year.
Yeah.
So, for example, let's say we're teaching a physical skills class. Instead of starting and insulting everybody, the in-service group there, by starting and okay, let's review the basics of handcuffing. Let's just put people in groups of 2 or 3, put them in a real simple scenario and say, okay, so you need to get the subject in handcuffs. They're going to cooperate, so away you go. And just let them do it and see where everybody's at with their handcuffing. Now, they might all be great with their handcuffing, do a great job. So we've started at level 5 or 6. Now we're moving on. Now, if a bunch of people are struggling because they can't remember the fundamentals, then if we say to the group, okay, so how many of you would like us to go back and just do a quick review of the basics of handcuffing? A bunch of the hands are going to go up. But now they're not insulted because it was their idea, not our idea. We didn't insult them by starting at and teaching to lowest common denominator. There's a lot of research that says that people will rise up to or step down to the level of your expectations. And there's all kinds of research and evidence that has shown that when you set your expectations for the group high, that people will very often rise up to those expectations. So let's get out of this mentality of starting at the lowest common denominator, teaching to the ones and the twos, and let's give people some credit. These are experienced people. A lot of them have been frustrated by the training that they've gone through in the past. And let's raise the expectations. Let's change it up so it's different all the time. We teach the same fundamental principles, concepts, teaching points to meet the post standards, but we can change the way that we teach it every single year, and we can get people engaged. How about if we start off a physical skills research class, or maybe it's their annual certification, by saying, okay, who's used some of the stuff we taught you last year out in the field and had it work for you? And so a couple people are going to put their hand up, and let's share those stories and say, okay, now let's be honest. How many of you have tried to use some of the stuff we taught you and it didn't work? And then some of the hands are going to go up. Okay, let's talk about that. Talk about the scenario. Now we can recreate some of these scenarios right in the class and have people work through it, brainstorm it. You can show a clip from a video with an officer who is in a fight and they're in a situation. And you can say, okay, so think about it for a minute. How are you going to get out of this? So you're on the ground, subject is on your back, and this has happened and this has happened. Actually, you know what? Let's just go right in the combatives room right now, and let's partner up and put you in that position. You got your duty belts on, work through it. Just go slow, work through it, and how are you going to fix it? What are your options? And let them do it on their own. And what the research on learning says is those desirable difficulties are good. When we struggle a little bit, when we have to work through it, we're learning critical thinking skills, we're learning problem-solving skills, and now those solutions are going to be ingrained at a deeper neurological level, and we're going to function far better out in the street. So what we need to do is continue to think differently about how we design and deliver training, engage people in training, and let's just stop some of the stuff that we've been doing for 20 or 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, challenge the assumptions is a theme that we discuss on this podcast a lot. You have to challenge all assumptions. If you don't, what is doctrine on day one becomes dogma forever after. And that was a quote from John Boyd, and that's been a recurring theme in several of the discussions that we've had. And the thing I love the most about that advice that you're given is it was their idea. And so this requires an instructor to be dynamic and to feel out their audience and to not go into the room with, okay, we've got a 2-hour block. We're going to do this, and this. And that's exactly how it's going to go. Whereas you go in there and you have a little bit of an assessment period. They don't necessarily know it's an assessment period, but you can kind of feel out where they're at. And then you adjust on the fly. And like you said, you do it in a way that makes it their idea. And that requires, as an instructor, that you know what you're doing and that you've thought about this and you've thought about all the, the 3 or 4 different spots that you might end up starting at. And that is something that, unfortunately, most instructors, the good ones that I know and that I've seen teach, have learned on their own. It's not something that we do enough as at the institutional level where we're bringing people up, because you go through an instructor course and it's and I think this was a term you used, Brian, at your class at ILETA, was it's an advanced student course. You go through firearms instructor school and you're not doing a whole lot of teaching, you're doing a whole lot of doing. And that's not what makes you a good instructor. You have to figure out what you're looking for and really refine that and challenge your assumptions on where you do things. I think you started to get into an area that was going to lead me into my next topic, but I need to take a short break to mention Right-On Optics and to thank them for supporting the show. Right-On is bringing you quality-built scopes, red dots, and binoculars with HD glass from Japan at a great value with an unconditional lifetime guarantee. Right-On is a veteran-owned company, and Brady, the owner, also has a law enforcement background. They support veterans, public safety, and of course, this podcast, so please go check them out at rightonoptics.com. You can use the discount code TACTANGENTS for 15% off. So, Brian, that other thing that it felt like you were starting to lead us into, or at least maybe I'm just reading into that because that's where I want to go, was some of the imagery stuff. Because you mentioned you can watch a video and you could get people kind of thinking about what they would do and how they would get out of this situation, and it becomes a mental exercise. And one thing that I've seen about the courses, and I haven't been to one yet, I hope to make it to one soon, but just reading the descriptions online and talking to some other people that have been, one thing that I've seen is that you have some emphasis on imagery and mental rehearsals. And we've talked a little bit about that on the show before, but really just scratched the surface. And I know there's plenty of research on it and it's well accepted as an effective component of training, but I think there's some people out there who have their doubts, or they think it's just snake oil or something and haven't really bought into the idea. What would you say to those people?
Well, I think what we need to do is step back and, as you said, look at the research. And there's all kinds of scientific research to validate the use of imagery. And really, when we understand what imagery is a process to focus and direct the imagination. And we're going to use it to enhance performance. So that's why I refer to it as performance enhancement imagery. So our imagination is working all the time. The importance of this, and the reason that all Olympic athletes do imagery, that pretty much all the professional athletes, all of the collegiate level athletes are doing imagery, that special forces, the top performers in the world in any field are using imagery. And so it's not some mind meld woo-woo training. It's something that we do, all of us do every single day. So if you're planning a dinner party, or you're planning a gathering with a group of people, you're planning a business meeting, you're planning a presentation that you're going to do, you're using imagery because you're imagining what's going to happen. You're imagining who's going to be there. You're imagining how long it's going to take to do some of these exercises where they're engaged. We're imagining what questions might come up, what challenges, what obstacles. We're imagining what other drills we could do. We're imagining how we might take some of these conversations. That's imagery. Everybody's heard of if then, when then thinking. That's imagery. If I'm thinking about if this was to happen, if I go to pull up to this bank and I look through the glass windows at the front and I see that there's a robbery in progress, what am I going to do? That's imagery. Now, the if then is we're brainstorming. So if this was to happen, then what are my options? What can I do? Am I going to back out of there? Am I going to get on the cell phone and call this in? If I'm going to call this in, what am I going to say? Am I in uniform? Am I off duty? Am I armed? Am I not armed? So we play these scenarios out. You talked about tactical teams. A tactical team, before they go do an entry or execute a high-risk warrant, they're going to do a briefing. That briefing is imagery. Here's the primary access point, and here's what we're going to do if we get jammed up at the front door. Then this is going to be the secondary access point. This is what we expect. This is the layout of the house. Everybody in the team is imagining their roles, their responsibilities. You're imagining what could go wrong, how are you going to fix those problems. So we use imagery in our lives all the time. What we need to start to become aware of is how are we using it? How can we be more intentional about it? And as trainers, then how can we be intentional about building it into our training? And one of the things, we spend a fair amount of time in the 5-day Excellence in Training course on imagery, with the basic stuff, with stuff that's 30 seconds long, all the way up to structured and scripted imagery sessions that can be 20, 30, 45 minutes long. And the value of this is that your mind cannot differentiate between something that's fantasized or imagined in the mind and something that's real. So we can actually train the same neural pathways and enhance skills through the application of imagery. Just think about sports. You see an athlete that gets injured. They're off. They miss a number of weeks, a number of months. They miss maybe an entire season. And how many times have we seen them come back right at the top of their game? People go, wow, that was amazing. Well, because they didn't play for 3 months or they didn't play for a year. Well, they may not have physically played for 3 months or played for a year, but they were playing all the time in their mind. They're running through plays, they're imagining. They're actually performing better in their mind than they are in the field. And so the reason why it's so important for us as trainers and as public safety professionals to understand imagery is that the language that we use, what we're imagining for outcomes, the videos that we watch and how we use those videos in training can either set people up for success or set them up for failure. We can either program people to perform at the highest levels, or we can program people to shut down in the field in these dynamic events. So imagery is a critical piece. I think it's the missing piece of the puzzle in human performance. You mentioned it's well accepted. It is in a lot of fields. It is not super well accepted or used to the extent it should be within the law enforcement profession, and we need to start to change that.
I think it's important that, you mentioned that it could be as short as 30 seconds, and so there's a time component where in a lot of things when it comes to training, we think about, I have to fit that in somewhere, and it doesn't take a lot of time. It could be when you're on the road, driving to work or driving from work and some of that. And I also think a lot of people think that the people that do buy into imagery on a fundamental level, they think to themselves, well, it's just a what if game. And it's not, you're just playing the what if game. And it's, well, kind of, but at least from what and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but from what I've learned and read about it is you got to go, it's the details matter, right? So the details matter because what you're trying to do is prepare your mind so that you've been there before. And so it's not just people think, oh, the guy pulled out a knife, I'd shoot him. Oh, okay, I'd just shoot him, right? Well, what if, and this is where you kind of start, is what if he gets a hold of my gun? How am I going to, okay, I'm going to try to muscle it away this way. Okay, well, what if that leverage game just isn't in my favor and I don't have the musculature to overpower this person? And you really start thinking about what is it going to feel like? What is it going to smell like? What is it going to look like? What is, and the details matter as far as, based on the reading that I've done on it. And so the level of what ifing that you have to do, so to speak, has to go down all of those rabbit holes. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And that's why we need to start small and just do it in little pieces and then start to build on those pieces. And, some keys is start small, but again, pick something specific that you want to work on and then imagine those specific elements and then start to add some of those other factors for there. So you talk about the subject with the edge weapon. So, I mean, for me to imagine dealing with a subject with an edge weapon, that's not enough information. Are they 30 feet away from me and they have a knife and they're screaming at me, but there's a whole bunch of barriers between the two of us? Or is this somebody, so for example, one officer that I talked to and I interviewed, she is leaving a store, holds a door open for a guy that she thinks about to walk in, and he pulls a knife and starts stabbing her. Now, she sees it as it's coming down and kind of that ice pick attack and gets her hand up to block it, but the knife goes all the way through her hand into her neck. And then the fight's on. And I mean, she gets cut up quite badly. She gets stabbed twice in the neck. Her left thumb is almost cut off her hand. Extensor tendons in her right hand are severed, but she wins that fight.
Wow.
I've talked to officers that have been shot numerous times. So one friend of mine got shot 5 times at contact range. And when I asked Marcus, how did you perform as well as you did? He talked about the fact that he had imagined on a number of occasions getting shot, staying focused, staying in the fight, winning the fight, and going home to his wife and his kids afterwards. So what he said is that night when I got shot, it wasn't that big a shock to me. I'd been there, done that, won the fight before. So we're going to imagine successful outcomes, but we can imagine dealing with those problems. We can imagine getting shot. We can imagine getting stabbed. We can imagine getting punched and working through that. But if we fail to do that, then we're going to potentially freeze up or fail to respond in the most desirable manner when that happens. If we imagine failing, so if I think when you get shot, you're dead, or when you get shot, that's gonna knock you off your feet. And I've talked to numerous officers that have been involved in shootings, and what they say is, I thought I was getting good hits, but then I started to think I must be missing because he's not going down like they do in the movies. And so those are the files that are at their subconscious level. And when you shoot somebody, they're going to go down, or you shoot a subject in the head and it's all over. And that's not reality. So imagery allows us to prepare for those events, prepare for all of those different possibilities, and we start to build those positive files that allow us to work through and fix problems fairly rapidly when they happen. That's the real value of imagery. And this is kind of a tangent question because that's what we do. What about the dreams that a lot of police officers talk about having, where they're shooting and the gun's not going off, or they're shooting the guy and he's not reacting? Do you have any information on the research and where that comes from? And I've seen some, and I can't remember exactly how it explains it. But again, that's your subconscious mind working through some of those issues and working through some of those problems. Now, I've talked to officers who said, I wake up with this dream, and then what I do is I imagine fixing it and imagining a successful outcome to that problem, and then I just allow myself to go back to sleep. So we're changing those programs in the subconscious minds. I think those dreams are more of a concern to us at a conscious level than it is at a subconscious. Those things are not necessarily programming our subconscious mind, because our mind doesn't process new information during sleep. From my understanding of sleep is it reviews information and makes connections that we haven't made before. But what we need to ask ourselves is, when I am imagining being involved in these events, when I'm watching a video, when I'm hearing a story, am I imagining how I would work through that? So let me give you an example. We watch a video of an officer, and cops have all seen way too many of these videos where the officer gets killed in the fight, loses the fight. And so afterwards, what happens is a lot of times the discussion in the class is about all the things that the officer did wrong. And what we actually are doing is programming some of those people in the class for failure and to do exactly what that officer in the video did. As opposed to, because the greatest lie in law enforcement always starts with the same 7 words. If I was there, I would have. And everything that comes after that is crap, is bullshit, because the only person who knows what they would do is the person that was there and did what they did. Now, if we change it and we ask ourselves, when I find myself in that situation or something similar, what would I most like to do? How would I most like to perform? And we imagine ourselves in that situation. We imagine working through the challenges and the obstacles. We imagine getting shot. We imagine getting cut in that fight. And working through it and working through solutions. Now we're programming a different outcome in our subconscious level. And that's the key piece. What we need to understand is that the argument that people make a lot of times comes from the conscious mind. When you're in the middle of a tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving event, a spontaneous event, or a high-stress event, or a time pressure event, your conscious mind, that logical, analytical, rational part of your mind, it's not driving the bus. Your subconscious mind is driving the bus. And the question is, have we programmed the subconscious mind to perform at the highest level? And if we haven't, then we're doing a disservice to ourselves and to the people that we train. That's the power of imagery. We put those files in at the subconscious level to allow people to respond at the most desirable manner when there's no time to think their way through it.
Now, what about physical skills? Because you mentioned the sports player thing, and he gets injured, and he does his. He's not playing. He's not practicing maybe because of an injury, but he does the imagery. How much practice do we need to set aside for imagery versus our physical skills, shooting, fighting, driving, those sorts of things?
Well, ideally, we're doing both. Ideally, we're training in both. But the reality is even if we have limited access to the range, limited access to a training facility, limited access to a training partner, we can still enhance all of those physical skills. Let me share a quick story with you. There's an officer from my former agency that about 18 months after he graduated from recruit training, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And he was told it was extremely serious, very rare form of brain tumor. 2 weeks after getting the diagnosis from the neurosurgeon, he was told he's having brain surgery. Now, what he was told is you got a 50-50 chance of living through the surgery. If you happen to live through the surgery, you're going to be in a hospital 6 to 8 weeks, auxiliary hospital 6 to 8 months after that. You're done as a cop. You'll never work again as a police officer, and you may never work again in your life because we're going to do some damage when we take that tumor out, and you're going to have to learn how to walk and talk and swallow and perform a lot of your fine motor functions again. This officer had been trained in imagery as a recruit. We taught imagery, and we did a lot of imagery with our recruits. So he's told in the hospital 6 to 8 weeks. Now, he starts doing imagery on the third day after the brain surgery. First 2 days, he's in a medically induced coma to allow the swelling in his brain to go down. And on the third day, once he's out of that medically induced coma, he starts doing imagery every single night. 11 days after the brain surgery, they discharge him from the hospital. 12 months after the meeting with the surgeon, he's back to work with light duties, and a month later, he's back to full duties. And one of the things that he did during his rehab is he knew he was going to have to go back and qualify with his firearms again, so he did a lot of imagery around that. He went 14 months, 15 months, never picked up a gun. Had major brain surgery, removed this tumor, and he improved his shooting skills. He was a better shooter after the brain surgery than he was before because of the imagery. So imagery not only allowed him to overcome all the odds around recovering from the brain surgery, but it allowed him to enhance a physical skill of shooting through the use of imagery. That's the power of this tool.
That's an amazing story, and I know that there's been we've heard stories like that, and I know some of the studies they've done where they've taken sports players or athletes and they've done performance with it and without it, and so I know that for individual officers or people who work in public safety, it's difficult to find the training time and to get the hours in. But if there's a takeaway there, if I'm hearing Brian right, it's there's no excuse for not being able to get in the mental work. You can maybe getting out to the range or getting to the mat room is hard or whatever, but the mental work you can still do. You could still fit that in somewhere, and you're still going to see some enhancement with that. I think that's a big takeaway. Are there any resources specifically for imagery? If someone just wanted to read a book on it, or a podcast or something like that, is there a place that people can go so they can read about some of that research or what they should know to get it right?
Well, there's some books out there now. What I recommend is people, if there's any listeners that are golfers, and even if you're not a golfer, if you read any of the books by Bob Rotella. Bob Rotella is a sports psychologist who works with a ton of golfers. And he's written some very good books around mental imagery. Book I highly recommend is one called With Winning in Mind by Lanny Basham. He became a world championship shooter and an Olympic gold medalist. And he talks in the book about the power of imagery and how he used imagery. There's another book called Imagery and Sport that, again, is talks a lot about imagery. It's a textbook. So if you're not into textbooks, there's some other ones. There's one very good one called Hockey Tough that goes through some different imagery tools that can be used with hockey players, but it's easy enough to translate those fundamental skills into imagery for pretty much everything. So those would be a few of the resources. There's a lot of great books out there, but those would be a few of the resources that you could have a look at. Awesome.
Those are, again, we've got a huge list of books. I will try to get all of these listed somewhere, but otherwise you might just have to go listen through again and hear the titles. So basically my last question before I just open it up for anything else that you want to share, but you are designing an academy, a police academy from the ground up. What are your first moves? What are your priorities?
I would suggest that people talk about or look at the research. So look at the research around humans, how humans learn, because most academies right now, the way that they're designed flies in the face of how humans learn. And so what it says is that block training, so we do a big block of control tactics, big block of firearm, big block of driving. We do all this training in blocks. That block training is feel good for the students, feel good for the instructors. They will get to that level to pass the test very quickly, but their ability to retain the information drops off radically. So I would look at the research around spaced practice, around interleaving or random variable training, around the role of reflection, active retrieval, the power of low stakes or no stakes quizzes, and think about how can we design an academy that is designed to create the greatest level of learning and retention and ability to recall and apply. I would strive to break down all the silos in training. We had all these groups in an academy that all teach their thing, and most of them don't know what anybody else is teaching. We're not overlapping. We're not reinforcing. We're not supporting what other people teach. I would break down those silos, and I would look at how can we apply the research and learning. Washington State Criminal Justice Training Academy does a very good job of this, especially with their physical skills training. The Oregon Academy, DPSST, is just in the process of restructuring their entire academy. I would recommend people go and subscribe to the Force Science Institute, forcescience.org. And Bill Lewinsky has published a series of articles on learning, and they're actually looking to work with some law enforcement academies to help them design an entire curriculum that's based on the research. So those are the kind of some simple things that I would start with, and then figure out how do we apply that within the framework that we have.
Awesome. Those are great insights. Brian, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. Is there any personal message that you have for our audience, or somewhere they can get more information about you and the work that you do?
Well, most of my information is on my main website, which is winningmindtraining.com. I also have a membership site for law enforcement trainers that are willing to invest $1 a day in their growth and their development. That is Excellence in Training Academy, all one word, excellenceintrainingacademy.com. But I guess the challenge I would leave people with is continue to push yourself. You mentioned before about challenge the assumptions, and I love that philosophy. And something that I heard recently is somebody said that dogma can only exist in the face of ignorance. That in order for us to be dogmatic about this is the only way, you have to be ignorant to all the other information, all the other research, all the other ways that are out there. And so it's that philosophy of strong beliefs held loosely. I have these beliefs. How do I know, what I think I know? But can I continue to read and learn and research and ask questions and listen to podcasts like yours so that I can challenge the assumptions and continue to think differently? So I would encourage people to just keep listening, keep reading, keep learning, keep challenging the assumptions, and be willing to embrace the pursuit of excellence. And that's about the biggest challenge we can have.
Great. Well, thanks again for that, and thanks again for sitting with me. I also want to thank Point Six. Point Six has mastered merino wool, and they outperform their competitors in several tests that measure moisture and evaporation. They sponsor the podcast, so make sure you go check them out. Their products are made in the U.S. and have a lifetime guarantee. You can use the discount code TACTangents2019 for 25% off. Again, it's TACTangents2019, and their website is point6.com, point6.com. You can subscribe to our podcast for new episodes on the 1st and 15th of each month. And if you want to support the show, head over to Patreon and give us $1 for new episodes. That money goes right back into bringing you good content. Find us on social media at TacTangents, or reach out to us by email, info@tacticaltangents.com. And if you're on Facebook, be sure you go check out our discussion group that we have on our page to stay up to date on the latest show-related news. That's all we got. Thanks again, Brian, for being here.
My pleasure.
All right. Good talk.